Thank you very much for being this afternoon. My name is Blandine Antoine. I'm French, as my accent can tell you. And I'll try to tell you a bit more about the Energy Wor tour, which is a project that Elodie and myself did last year. We traveled during 7 months in 17 different countries to try to meet with people that innovate in the field of energy. And so in this presentation, I'll try to tell you a bit about why I think it's important that we talk about energy, how we try to promote these questions and raise awareness in France on this topic, and then go through a few projects that we've seen during that world tour, before just telling you very briefly what we've done after that. Please interrupt me with any questions that you may have, and let me know if I speak too fast, because I tend to get a little excited when I talk about this project sometimes. So let's go ahead. So why do we need to talk about energy, and how is it linked to environment and development in general? For the past 30 and 20 years, more especially, people have been getting more and more concerned about the fact that human activities are having a big impact on the environment. And we can date like a strong commitment to trying to make things better from 1987, when the Brundtland Commission put together a report whose name was Our Common Future, and which stands as the formal definition of what sustainable development is: a development that takes care of economics, social, and environmental aspects of development in enterprises. 10 years later, the Kyoto Protocol, which you all have heard about, I guess, took into account the fact that human industrial activities are sending more and more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, and this is measured in terms of concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere, and that has been increasing from 280 ppm before the Industrial Revolution in Europe to more than 350 ppm today. And a lot of awareness has been given to that topic, because this is related to global warming. So tons of graphics have been put together to try to explain this correlation. This one here just gives you the CO2 variation and shows how it has been increasing in the last few years. So as you can see, the graphic is in years ago and not years in the future, as it's already usually set. So not only have we exceeded the concentration that were reached in 400,000 years before today, but we've bypassed them by a huge amount. And this is linked to temperature variations that could become quite problematic for the development of our planet. How is CO2 linked to temperature? Well, this is a greenhouse effect that you know about. And a lot of people are asking, so what's the problem with it? There's several aspects of that problem. One is that temperature variation has consequences on the environment, such as rising sea levels, changing climates, increasing patterns of disease, proliferation, etc. But how much can we expect this increase in temperature to be? And that's the second problem. We don't know. So there's a lot of uncertainty on how much temperature change will be accounted by the increase in emissions. And this is a chart put together by the MIT Joint Program on the Science and Policy of Climate Change. And it tries to tell you, well, this is a climate wheel. It's like a roulette wheel. We don't know. But there are probabilities associated to each of those temperature rises given a certain pattern of emissions. So if we don't put any constraints on our emissions and continue the business of usual patterns, which is really increasing very fast, as shown on the previous graph, well, there's a very strong possibility that will exceed 2 to 3 degrees, because that's all the rest of the chart is a possibility of going to a temperature increase bigger than 2 to 3 degrees. To give you some idea of what this means, the last glacial age was only 3 degrees in temperature lower than today, and a change in 5 degrees was associated to the largest extinction of species when the dinosaurs, etc., died millions of years ago. The change was only of 5 degrees. And that change occurred on a period that extended for several thousands of years. We're talking about a change that would happen in a century. So it's not only a big change, but it's also a very rapid one. And it's quite unlikely that living species could adapt to it as easily as they did in the past, when 95% of them got extinct. So what would happen if we did not follow this business as usual pattern, but try to constrain our emissions to 550 ppm. 550 ppm is about twice the level of pre-industrial age. And when we do so, we realize that the probability of being lower than 2 degrees, which is the target that the European Union has committed to, they say we'll try to curb our emissions so that we can reach a maximum of 2-degree increase in temperature, becomes about 50%. So this is a motivation for a lot of people to say, well, even if we don't know exactly what will happen, even if there's a slight possibility that by doing nothing we would stick to 2 to 3 degrees, it's much better if we do something, because the probability of getting things constrained in a reasonable spectrum are much higher. It's like an insurance policy, basically, that we're buying by trying to curb our emissions. So this was about climate, but there's other aspects to the environment, not only climate. In 2007, last year, 2 big reports were published. One was by the IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, who's the agency that, the panel of experts put together by the UN to follow climate issues. And this report stated very strongly that now we know that human activities have an impact on the climate, and also tried to put a number on the temperature difference that we could expect by 2100, which, as I mentioned before, is uncertain, but is between 1 and 6 degrees, with different probabilities associated to each rise in temperature. The severe consequences of this rise in temperature were highlighted, but the second report came afterwards and was not as much promoted and publicized, although it was quite important too. It's a GEO4 report by the UNEP, the United Nations Environmental Programme. GEO stands for Global Environmental Outlook. And this one was trying to say, well, we have several crises going on. Not only do we have climate, but we also have biodiversity crisis, land use crisis, and they are all linked to the development crisis that is affecting a wide portion of the world. Development, energy, and environment, says this report, are interrelated issues. And knowing that, they calculated what's called the footprint, which is a way to try to convert our use of natural resources into an area, and saying, well, what do we use and what can the planet provide sustainably? As you can see, we're using the equivalent of almost 22 hectares per person. That's an average globally. That means in Europe, in the US, we're using much more than that. And the Earth's carrying capacity, meaning what she can sustainably produce in terms of renewable products, livestock, like fisheries, etc., not being exhausted, is only 16 hectares. So we're using much more than we should. Getting back to energy is easy once we've made this picture, because we realize that energy is a major contributor to greenhouse gases emissions. I highlighted here power stations, which provide electricity, residential, commercial, and other sources, which is mostly heating. Fossil fuel retrieval, processing, and distribution, transportation fuels are all related to energy. And as you can see, they are the most direct sources of greenhouse gases emissions that you can think of. This graph was done for the emissions in 2000. They have changed a little since then, but not much. And then we take into account some indirect sources where you need energy, like industrial processes, land use, and biomass burning, knowing that biomass is burnt in developing nations as a cooking fuel for 90% of the time. Then you realize that energy is a big issue when you talk about environment. So we want to reduce the emissions linked to energy. The obvious thing would be to say, well, let's not use energy. However, this is not very easy to defend because energy is intimately linked to development. This graph shows the Human Development Index, which is an aggregate of life expectancy, access to schools, and access to health plus GDP. So it's a slightly better measure than GDP of how people fare in their countries, versus the annual consumption of electricity per person in those countries. So as you would have guessed, the African countries are low on the graph. The industrial countries are high on the graphs on both aspects. So I'd like to ask you a question. What does this graph tell you? I think it tells us two things at least, and I'm sure you would find them just as quickly as I would. So would anyone guess or say something? What would you say? What does the graph tell you?
I don't know. Would developed countries can save more energy?
that's something that we could get as a conclusion. But to get to that conclusion, first we say that the developed countries have higher energy consumptions, very basic, and that the higher you are on the consumption chart, the better you fare somehow, right? This graph is an increasing function. So the more you consume energy, the better you fare. There's a second thing that this graph tells us, and it's linked to this 4,000 boundary here. Above this boundary, except for a few countries like South Africa, Russia, and Saudi Arabia, whose political context is a bit different and might also explain why the Human Development Index is low, although they consume a lot of energy. When we go higher than those 4,000 kilowatt hours per year per person, then there's not much change in the Human Development Index. There's like a threshold that you don't need to go higher than this to have a good development. So if we want to take those two things that we just discovered, although they're quite obvious, and see how can we lower our emissions, the first thing is we must increase the access of the poorest countries to modern energy forms like electricity, because then they would rise in development, and as an ethical and also economic point, this is something that we need. But if we want them to do so while keeping at least the average of our consumption at the same level, if not lower, we need to increase the efficiency of the intermediate countries, of the way they use electricity and energy in general. In this bunch, you see countries such as Kazakhstan, Poland, Chile, Mexico, Ukraine. Their industrial framework can be modernized, and you could have much better use of electricity and energy in those countries without affecting their development much, and even eventually increasing it. And obviously, we must put into we must do energy savings and reduction of energy use actions in the countries that fare the better and where waste can be more easily trimmed. So those are the three actions that I think we can keep in mind and try to keep in the back of our heads. Well, I'll try to show you a few of the projects that we've seen during that project. So now let's go about, I'll just present you briefly Prometheus in English, as the name of a nonprofit that a few friends and I put together in June 2006, trying to raise awareness on the questions that we've just discussed and try to promote knowledge and will to take actions on energy and greenhouse gases reduction. So 3/4 of man-made CO2 emissions come from fossil fuel burning. Knowing that, and knowing that those emissions are linked to environment, and realizing that energy challenges in the 21st century take a specific form that has, in our opinion, at least 3 feet. One is global warming, the second is increased scarcity of fossil fuels, and the third one is a challenge of helping developing countries go higher in the development index. We wanted to try to explain to a lot of people how complex this problem was and how easy, although it's complex, it can be addressed if everybody gets to work on it. So we wanted to foster interest on those questions and empower people that are not technicians and not engineers who don't always know about energy technologies and what they can be used for to understand the issues that they see on the headlines of the newspapers without always knowing what's behind. So to do that, we created this NGO, Prométhée, like the Titan from the Greek mythology that goes up on the mountain to fetch fire. What is fire? Fire is knowledge. We're not saying that we are Prometheus, but we say that everybody can be one and can go up the mountain and reach the knowledge and take it out of the grasp of the people who say they know and don't want you to meddle with their affairs, etc. So it's somewhat of an ideal democracy that we'd like to see applied to the problems of energy and technology knowledge. So to do that, since we're not big, there was only 4 of us at the beginning, we decided to find a very concrete, practical target, and those were elementary schools. Elementary schools are easy to get reached to because they have the obligation in France to do education to sustainable development and environmental issues. So we were providing them with class material that they could use in this context. Plus, in elementary schools, you only have one teacher teaching all the different topics. So since energy technologies and development are very broad issues that have to be dealt with multidisciplinary knowledge, it was obviously a good choice to find a person that you could talk to and not have to talk to the 7 different teachers that can teach math, French, physics, etc. at higher grades. So we had 7 classes in our partnership. They were French, but France French schools are a bit of everywhere. We were working with a French school in Japan, a French school in Réunion Island, which is a part of France, but that's in the Indian Ocean, and 3 schools in France. So when we visited those schools, we tried to do energy projects with them. So that was our visit to the Réunion class in a windmill farm. And when we were in different countries, we also had the opportunity to do a few talks to local pupils. And this was, for example, in Pakistan, in Multan. It was a girls' school where we talked about energy and tried to do little experiments on how you get oil out of the ground using Coca-Cola and chalk. That was fun. This is the class material that we developed. So it's organized in 7 themes. What is energy? What is electricity? Fossil energies, nuclear energy, renewable energies, how to use energy, and climate. And it's organized with little comic strips that are supposed to bring the attention of pupils to the topic that we're going to talk about. So for example, this one is taken from the What's Energy topic. So this little guy, who's one of the heroes of our comic strip, is trying to understand the difference between kinetic energy, solar energy, thermal energy, etc. And that's the way that we try to bring the students to those topics during the whole thing. It can be downloaded on our website. And for now, it's only in French, but we're trying to do new partnerships to get it translated, especially in English and Spanish, so that we can have a broader audience. This was complemented by the world tour that I introduced before. So during 7 months, we traveled in those countries, trying to see different projects and trying to see what's new in those projects. So what we called innovations were not only technological innovations, not only the new ways to produce or use energy. It was also how innovative the people were in trying to implement those technologies. The typical example has to do with solar panels. Solar panels are well-known technologies that have been around for almost 40 years now. But using them in Africa to bring electrification to isolated villages is more a challenge regarding the institutions and the financial barriers that you have to go against than regarding the technology itself. And so finding projects in Morocco and Zambia where people succeeded in deploying them was very interesting to us. But we also looked at research labs and how they dealt with this problem, especially in the US. And I'd like to mention a few of those afterwards. So we had partners, which were numerous and very generous. And now I'd like to show you a bit more pictures about the project that we've seen. So we were not only looking at new energies, not only renewable energies, because we know that energy is, for 80% of its world use, is from fossil fuels. So this is a project in Angola. It's the company Total operates an FPSO, which is this big boat. It stands for floating production, storage and offloading tanker. So it's basically an oil tanker that's been converted by adding a plant on top of it so that it could at least pre-treat and purify part of the oil that's getting extracted. So why do they use a boat? Because this is 135 kilometers away from the African coast. So it's too deep. You can't put a platform here. They just put a big boat that they anchor at the bottom of the sea. And then they send robots to drill the wells where the oil is extracted. So what is new in this project? It was not only the fact that making these platforms work is a logistical challenge. What was interesting to us is that on this project, they want to avoid that. They don't want to flare the gas. So in an oil reservoir, you get both oil and gas. And gas represents about 10% of the oil production. So usually, when you don't have access to a gas market, when you don't have liquefying plants, when you don't have a distribution infrastructure, you would just burn the gas because you have nowhere to put it, especially if you're on a boat. You don't have a big storage tank that you can use, so you flare it. And flaring gas worldwide represents about 6% of the world use of natural gas. So it's a huge waste, and it's also a big source of greenhouse gases emissions because the gas being burnt is, becomes CO2. But in this project, what they were going to do was to compress that gas and reinject it into the reservoir. So there are several advantages to that. First of all, you don't burn the gas, so the environment is happy. Secondly, you enhance slightly the production of oil because you maintain the pressure in the reservoir so the oil continues to flow. And thirdly, the host countries are very happy because maybe one day gas and oil will be so expensive that it might become financially viable to actually build a liquefying plant or a pipeline so that you would use that gas and then sell it to somebody. And it so happens that more and more countries that have access to those oil reservoirs are trying to put into their contracts the obligation from the exploiting company to actually do that. So that was quite interesting. We also went to Norway. And in Norway, we saw this interesting project which wants to put windmills, except that they are sea mills somehow, off the coast so that they would produce electricity by using the tidal current. So tidal current has several advantages. One is that it's regular, so it can be predicted, in opposition to windmills, which you can't really know when you will have wind and electricity from. They're also underwater, and water is 800 times more dense than air. So you need to have, you don't need to have as big mills as you would when you're using wind. And of course, it's not very widely used today because there are a few constraints associated to the environment that we're working with. Seawater is very corrosive. So it's interesting that this is happening in Norway because Norway has extensive knowledge of offshore, deep offshore oil production, and the knowledge acquired by those engineers was then used to do those big steel structures that are now put on the sea and have to resist a lot of corrosion, etc. They also turn very slowly, so they don't cut the fish into small pieces, which is interesting. One of the drawbacks is that they take a lot of space, so you need to put them in places where you have enough water that the ships won't be put into trouble when they go through, or you have to use this kind of devices that are being tested now in Ireland, in England, so that the seas can actually see those towers and try to go around them without hurting them. So this is useful and interesting, but it's not the solution to the energy world crisis because it only works in a few places. It's good for isolated communities. For example, this project happening in Norway was meant to work for a village of 300 houses that was too far away from the grid to be connected there and would be displacing a diesel plant. So in a few cases, they can be very interesting. You've all heard about solar PV, photovoltaics, that are usually made from silicon, and more made from thin films. Most of those thin film technologies are from inorganic sources. So you would use indium, silicium, gallium, different sources of semiconductors, and try to make very thin films of them. And this project is a bit different in the sense that it wants to use organic solar cells. So they're made from polymers that don't have semiconducting properties per se, but have an energy gap that they can use to produce excitons that then becomes electrons, and you could produce electricity from them. So the advantage is that they're very cheap. Polymers are easy to get, they're easy to manufacture, easy to display in rolls. So why aren't they everywhere today? Because they have, first of all, a very low efficiency. They only convert about 5% of the energy from the sun into electricity compared to the 15 to 20% of conventional solar panels. But that would be okay given their very low price. The biggest inconvenience today is that they don't withstand very well the UV radiation from the sun, so they would become unusable very quickly. So people are working on trying to improve their resistance to time and irradiation, and also trying to make new encapsulation techniques that would protect them further. And also they don't like oxygen too much, so being put up on roofs would be a problem if they're not well protected. But this is a very promising technology. People hope that it would be in 10, 15 years available commercially, and that you could use them, put like T-shirts with plastic bands that could recharge your iPod, for example, and things like that. So it's quite interesting in the sense that it would have very broad applications, even though it has quite low efficiency. And this was happening, in Germany. In Germany, there's a little town in the south, which is called Freiburg. And Freiburg has a very interesting history that I'll present further, but they're basically the solar capital of Europe, even though they're in Germany, which is not the sunniest place in Europe. And they have this great technology center called the Institut Fraunhofer for Solar Energy. That is the biggest research lab in Europe on solar technologies, and that is developing those solar panels. Talking about the sun, there's another way you can harness the sun's electricity. The sun's power to make electricity, and this is using concentrating mirrors. So, on the right, is a plant that's not very far from here on the US scale. It's in the Mojave Desert, north of Los Angeles. And it's the biggest thermodynamic plant in the world. It produces 165 megawatts of electricity by concentrating the solar rays by those, thanks to those mirrors on the axis of the parabol that they're making. And through this axis is circulated an oil that gets heated and is sent to the central power plant that then transfers the heat from the oil to water, becomes steam, and thus produces electricity through turbines. And although it's, it doesn't seem very convenient because it takes up a lot of space. Problem with solar energy, that is the same problem for windmills, solar panels, biomass, which are all forms of solar energy, is that they're very, very diffuse, not dense at all. So it takes up a lot of space, but deserts are places with lots of space and lots of sun. So that's not so much of an issue, except when you can get rid of the investment part. And in the case of California, it's very useful because they produce their peak electricity in the afternoon, which is also the peak of electricity consumption in California, where everybody puts their air conditioning on. So Solel, the exploiting company of that place, sells its electricity at a very high price to Southern Edison, and thus makes a lot of profit and a huge return on investment. The second project is quite different. It's in India, in a place called Oroville. Oroville is a tiny city in the southeast of India that has the very idealistic goal of trying to promote a new kind of society where you would not need money, where people would be happy and live together and work together to promote a better world. And one of their objectives is to be independent from the grid for their energy, water, and waste distribution systems. So in this case, this is a solar kitchen. So this big semi-spherical bowl is made of locally made mirrors, and they concentrate the rays of the sun on this axis through which is circulated water in a big copper coil covered with aluminum. And this produces steam, and steam is used to cook rice. And so this device reduces the consumption of diesel that is normally used to produce this steam by 20% over the year, because you don't use it in the evening and the sun is not always here, etc. But it's a fairly big reduction of their consumption for not a very big price, since everything was locally made. So those were interesting ways of using the sun to provide energy but via another form than the ones that are mostly seen. Other sources of solar energy includes biomass. Those two projects are from Stanford, from the GSAP, which is a big project that the Stanford University has committed to work on energy and greenhouse gases reductions. So this project here aims at making electricity from plants. And it's very unusual because the idea is to go and get the electrons from the photosynthesis, and from those electrons make a current. So it seems quite utopical, but it actually works. You can make a current of 4 picoamperes, which is super small, but quite interesting in the way that it was developed. So nobody believes that this can ever be a big source of electricity, because you would need millions and billions of tiny chloroplasts to get a significant amount of energy. But there were all the technologies that have been developed to actually have access to that current, meaning nano-scale electrodes, a way to get the chloroplast to be kept non-moving for a time long enough that you would actually be able to get the electrode into them and not destroy them. All the imaging devices that were used to be able to monitor exactly where the things are and how you can have access to them, all those things could be very useful for other applications. So here, energy is a way to get funding, maybe, and find something more interesting afterwards. The second project is more realistic. So Chris Somerville is very well known in the plant biology sphere because he was the promoter of a big project, which was the genome project for plants. So his team and the people who worked with him were the first to decipher the DNA of one of those plants, which happens to be very used in biology because it grows fast, etc. And now he works with EBI, which is the big biofuel lab that has been set up in Berkeley with a big grant from BP of $500 million. And what they're trying to do is lignocellulose ethanol. You all know that ethanol as it is produced today is not very sustainable because it uses corn, and that's eatable, plus it doesn't have a very good energy balance overall. But if we could use everything in the plant and not only starch and sugar, then we could have much higher yields. And that's what he's working on. The idea is that you can get cellulose to be broken down in sugars and then fermented to make ethanol. But the cellulose, as it stands today in plant, is completely blocked by lignin. Lignin is a very ramified and aromatic made compound that is very hard to break. That's actually what makes plants stand and not just crumble and dissolve under the rain. So you have to break the lignin before getting access to cellulose, and that's very difficult. So some people are thinking, well, let's engineer plants that have less lignin and more cellulose. To do that, you need to know how cellulose is made. And even though it's one of the most abundant polymer from nature, we don't know that yet. And we don't know how the cells make cellulose. And that's what Professor Sonodal is working on. So it seems a bit far-fetched from energy, but it was just a way to show to people that a lot of fields have to be put together to solve this interesting problem that we'll have in the few years to come. Waste can also be a big source of energy. So here are a condensed form of 3 different projects. On the left here is a landfill in Brazil. So waste that are being put in landfills ferment without oxygen, and they produce methane and a few other gases. And recuperating this methane, first of all, avoids it to be released in the atmosphere, and given that methane is a very strong warming gas, it has 20 times the warming power of CO2, you have a good impact on the environment. And secondly, if you can use that methane to produce electricity or heat, then you have a double positive impact. So in this case, they have engineered the landfill so that you would be able to recuperate that methane. So there's plastic sheets that are being set underneath so that you eliminate the fact that all the water, etc., will leak out with lots of toxins into it. Then you put a layer of dirt, a layer of waste, a layer of dirt, a layer of waste to make a big sandwich, and you put tubes and pipes through that with holes in them so that they would recuperate the gas. And then the gas is sent to an engine that burns it and makes electricity. Or, in other cases, this is from a university in Brazil, where they've actually collected the manure and the sewage water from residents for students, and they ferment it in a much smaller scale than the landfill one, and then put everything into this big tank, from where it's then put into an engine that produces electricity. Or you could have a different setup, one that we've seen in India, in the Pondicherry Engineering College, where they use the gas that's produced for cooking purposes. So instead of using cow dung or wood, they can use gas that is cleaner to burn, doesn't make smoke, doesn't have bad health impacts, and also, once again, is avoids its release in the atmosphere and thus diminishes the impact on the warming power. We've talked a lot about energy production, but looking at the energy balance, you have to look both at the production and the consumption. So if we can increase the efficiency with which we use energy, will be just as well off as if we can increase the amount of energy that we produce. So here is just a brief presentation of ways to reduce energy consumption in buildings. Here is a ceiling and a lamp from BCIL, which is a company in India. BCIL stands for Be the Change, which is a motto by Gandhi, but also for bioconservation in India Limited. And they have a very interesting business plan in the sense that they want to make houses that have very little embedded energy. So the materials that are being used are very low on the production chain, meaning they're not cooked. They will never use bricks because bricks have a lot of embedded energy. They use a lot of wood, they use stones, and they try to use local materials. Another aspect that they're working on is trying to make their the building that they make, sustainable in the sense that they don't take too much out of the environment. For example, water. Water is a big problem in some parts of India. So when BCIL tries to build a plot of residences, they first of all assess the quantity of water that falls onto that plot every year, and from that they calculate how many people can live out of this water. it's a very interesting way of thinking, because usually people will say, well, I have this plot of land. People will pay so much and so much, or I have this size, and I can put as many people on that land as I want, and then I'll bring water from other sources. Whereas in this kind of projects, the water is collected, put into boreholes, treated, and then used in the houses, and so it's completely independent from the grid. Same with energy, same with waste treatment, which is very interesting in a country like India, where those services in some places are not always very efficiently met by the municipal services, etc. And also I have to mention that the houses they built not only have very low embedded energy, but they also have very low energy consumptions, because they have good isolations. The cooling, which is very important there, is provided through common services, so you have economies of scale going on, and also with quite intelligent designs that provide shade and things like that diminish the need of air conditioning. This project is in very different places. It's in Tokyo, a very industrialized urban area. And once again, it tries to increase the efficiency with which energy is used. So those big cupboards are fuel cells and reformers. So the tiny ones transforms natural gas or kerosene into hydrogen. That is being then, being used. Well, I hope you remember how it looked. Oh, here we go. That is then being used in this big thing, which is a stack of fuel cells. And so the fuel cells transform the hydrogen into water, heat, and electricity. The efficiency of the conversion to heat and electricity is 80%. It's only 35% if you only consider electricity, but since you also produce heat that you will then use in the house to heat the house and heat the water that you would use in baths and dishwashers, etc., the overall conversion has a much higher efficiency as if you were bringing the electricity from the grid, from a plant that was far away from your home, whose heat was released in the environment. So you're basically making a local power plant that is using the same input as what the big power plant was, which is natural gas. But you're also using the heat that's generated, and thus you have a much better efficiency. That is quite interesting. This is Freiburg again, the same place as the solar panel, the organic solar panel was developed. In this case, it's a whole neighborhood that's called Vauban, which was built with very stringent standards as far as energy conservation was concerned. This was built in 2000, and at that time they were lower than all the standards that were being applied elsewhere in Europe. And still today, even though it's already 8 years further in time, they're one of the most efficient places. So in this case, the architects were selected to develop a new area on basically standards that had to do with energy production and consumption. So you have very good isolation, larger windows, the materials that are local, and very happy people in general, because they live in a place where commuting is very easy, where everybody believes that energy should be produced locally, so they have tons of solar panels, and usually their houses are also very comfortable and modern. The last project here is in Hong Kong. So the Hong Kong municipality has set up a competition that's called Energy Efficiency Awards, to which everyone can contribute, can apply, as long as they are commercial and public offices. This is in the University of Hong Kong, and this picture is being taken in the toilets. So in the toilets, you can see the energy consumption of the university through time, so increasing until you reach summer, etc. And the point is, putting it in the toilets, everybody will see it. And if everybody sees it, then you can more easily tell them, well, you see, we've consumed so much so far, and that was our target. We've exceeded the target, so please don't forget to put out the light when you leave. And it actually works very well. They were one of the winners of the Efficiency Awards program, because not only did they promote efficiency through behavior change, but they also set up a few technical changes, like switching the lights to more efficient lights, changing the air conditioning, because in Hong Kong it's very humid and very hot, but air conditioning is used not only to reduce the temperature of the different rooms, but also to dry the air. And you can dry the air with much more efficient means, like dehumidificators, than using air conditioning. So this was also a good way to decrease our energy consumption. But let's get back to the problem that I stated in the beginning, that is development. 1.6 billion people in the world still lack access to electricity. That number would be bigger if we also took into account the fact that people have electricity, but only intermittently or with very low quality. Several programs have been set up to try to change that state of the world. And for example, in Morocco, where solar panels are being set in rural areas, and in India, where biodiesel and gasification plants are being distributed in the villages to try to change that. This was just to remind you that now we're talking about this part, of the graph that I think puts forth the question. And the idea is that it's feasible to get people to have better access to energy while increasing their GDP. So here is a graphic which is done by the International Agency for Energy. If you look at everything before 1975, then GDP and primary energy use were completely coupled. There's no difference between the two lines. However, after the energy crisis, we see that GDP grows faster than energy consumption. So we can uncouple growth and energy use, and that's by providing more efficient energy services. What's important is not the fact that this lamp is 10 watts or 100 watts. What's important is that it gives you so many lumens. The service is more important than the actual use, and that's something that people have been very slow to realize, because we tend to think in terms of what the initial input and not really the output when it comes to energy. So just to show that it's feasible, this graph here shows different countries that have been going through industrial revolutions: Great Britain, the US, Germany, France, Japan, and showing the energy intensity through time. Energy intensity is GDP per amount of energy used. Energy used per amount of GDP, and the lower it is, the less energy you need to get more growth. So the idea is that a lot of people are trying to get developing countries to be low on that graph so that they can have better energy services at a lower cost. So since we don't have much time left, and I think I would like to answer your questions, I'll go a little fast through those slides because there's lots of text on them, but we can come back to them through the questions if you want. So it is evident that sustainable development requires proper energy management. The goal of it would be to increase the standard of living of people who don't have access to good energy services. And to do that, we must focus on modern forms of energy that are basically gas for cooking and electricity for all other uses, and try to provide high-quality energy services. What's a high-quality energy service? It's a service that relies mostly on renewable forms of energy, so you would decrease the carbon intensity of our energy mix. That includes demand management, so conservation measures, efficient use of energy, having industries use the grid when it's less used by the people, etc., and promote energy efficiency in the technologies that are being used, so certification programs, labelization of items that are being bought, etc. Several barriers exist to the diffusion of this idea, especially in developing countries where financial markets are not very efficient, so access to capital is restricted. When you need to change a production apparel, it's quite hard to do so because you don't have the money to, and you can't borrow it at a low interest rate. And the lack of technical knowledge in some places might also be a big obstacle. Let's comment the pictures, that'd be easier. So if we want to promote rural electrification, there's several ways to do so. Extending the grid is the major one, because the grid has the advantage that you have as much electricity as you need, and you usually pay it at a lower rate. However, it has a high initial capital cost. So using smaller devices that are at the individual or village scale can be more efficient in terms of the use of resources. In Morocco, for example, in 1997, only 17% of the rural population had access to electricity. 10 years later, in 2007, that number jumped to 97%. How was this made? The state made a strong commitment to extend the grid for most of that percentage increase. And for the most remote areas, where it was very difficult to bring electricity lines, etc., then contracts were passed with private companies to deploy the solar panels and maintain them. So the state got into contract with companies for 10 years. They had to implement, to set up the solar panels, they had to maintain them, and they would collect revenues from the local populations. And it's very interesting to see that the states, said, I'm not able to do it, so I'll get a private company to do it. And that's something that's happening more and more, not only through social entrepreneurship, but also with big companies that got into contracts with the state and provide expertise, technical knowledge, and also their will to make profit, so they are sure to make the best investment possible. In India and China, a lot of gasification plants have been set up. The advantage of gasification plants is that they can use any kind of feedstock as long as you've got some carbon in them. So you can use agricultural revenues, you can use sawdust, you can use wood, you can use coal, put it into the gasifier, change the chemical energy of the organic products into chemical energy of a gas, because you produce hydrogen and CO and a little methane in that gas that is then being burnt in a motor and in an engine that produces electricity. So that's very convenient at a village scale. To increase the efficiency of the energy use, several programs can be put together. Some of them rely on the diffusion of more efficient technologies, for example, efficient lights. Some of them also try to promote the fact that tuning up your vehicle, maintaining your fridge, changing your pump are also very good ways of promoting electricity, so electricity conservation, energy conservation. So for example, this is an ad that was passed in a Pakistani newspaper where the government has set up garages equipped with computer-assisted tune-up centers where people will drive in, get their car audited, and then they can pay for the different changes that need to be made to make the car more efficient. In places where people don't buy cars every year and usually end up having the oldest ones, it is a very efficient way to save energy. This is another kind of program that can be done. It's basically showing what's a proper way to do things. This is in India. It's called the Retreat Center. It's a center that TERI, the Energy Research Institute, has built to make its conferences and with hotel rooms, etc. And it's very impressive in all the energy conservation measures that it has done. Especially they have natural ventilation, natural cooling, natural treatment of the waters, solar panels for electricity generation, and being there is a way to show that things are possible, and then you get more people interested in that question and actually realizing new projects. This is the Chinese certificate of energy conservation. It's the equivalent of Energy Star. And using certification and standardization programs is also a very good way to change behaviors, because people will be using and identifying the products with less energy consumption, and therefore promote their diffusion in the market, and therefore change the way that producers work and present more and more energy efficient products. Then we can also try to increase the share of renewable energy on the market. So this is biodiesel made from Jatropha crocus, which is a non-edible plant, and it's very interesting to a few countries, including India and Zambia, who want to plant hectares of this thing because it grows on not very good soils and doesn't need a lot of water. Or trying to promote solar energy, for example, in gas stations in Pakistan, where this solar energy is used to heat water that then cleans cars, and therefore, since a lot of people go to gas stations, they see that those panels are working and that a big company is investing in them, so maybe that's a good idea and I should do the same at my home. Such ideas are also interesting ways to diffuse technology. So as a conclusion, what have we done with all that so far? Elodie Renaud, who's not here today, she's in France, and myself have written a book to try to talk about the different energy innovations. Unfortunately, it's only in French, but if it sells well in French, we hope it will get translated to English. We'll also participated in a few conferences and set up a photo exhibit that is traveling through France. We were lucky enough to find people in California very interested in that project and trying to set up a local chapter of our NGO who's hoping to reach to elementary school kids through using the class material that we developed and getting it translated. And maybe do, when we have time, a startup that tries to promote the diffusion of energy technologies in developing countries. So I'm sorry I talked so fast, and I hope there were some interesting things in there for you. So if you have questions, I'd be very happy to take them and answer them. Thank you.
In your graph of development versus energy use, as you pointed out, all the most developed countries have pretty consistent levels of development, sure, but a wide range of energy consumption. And I mean, I have no idea why, but looking at it, it struck me that it seemed to be a combination of climate and population density. And it seems to me that a lot of developing countries would also have climate and population density issues that would kind of put them towards the right-hand side of that graph. Do you have any thoughts on how you can advance their development to get around whatever the issues are that are causing problems for Canada and the US and Australia?
So I've thought about it a lot, and population and density, I think, would be a good explanation if the graph was only about energy consumption in general, but this was only electricity. So for example, it doesn't take into account transportation, which is not electricity-based. So that doesn't go for explaining for the density. However, I do think that the bigger the country, the higher they go on the graph can be explained by this idea that you need to commute and transfer energy, etc., through longer distances. However, I think the spread in developing countries is big enough that you have places like Zambia with very scarce population, and thus that could be higher on the graph, and places like Bangladesh, which have very high density, but they're at the same level on the graph in terms of development index. So I think that a lot of thought has been given to why development happens in places or not, and geography is one of the big explanations, as points out Jeffrey Sachs, for example, in his book about the end of poverty. Saying that if you're in a landlocked country, you don't have exchanges, you can't do trading, and that will lower your development index because trade also has a big contribution. But trying to link it directly to energy, I think it's a bit harder because. What is electricity used for? It's used for lighting. It's used for industrial purposes. It's used for health devices. It really is not related to climate or density, I think. So I really don't know how to answer your questions. I think it's a very interesting one, but I apologize for not being the right person to ask it to.
So in your talk, you showed a lot of great ideas and great efforts that different people are using to try to solve this energy problem in different parts of the world. And many of these solutions are sort of adapted to the local region. So have you seen anything that seems like it might be relevant to the entire world, whereby that solution will go a long ways towards solving the global problem?
I think the main takeaway from our travels and our experience was that there is no one-shot solution. The success of the projects that we've seen was identifying the local needs, looking at the local constraints, and then finding the best way. But we're showing that we have a wide array of solutions to pick from, and that is feasible in each situation to find a way to go around the local constraints and meet the needs. For example, in Zambia. Zambia is a very poor country. It's number 166 out of 177 in the different rankings that the UN puts up. And people there have very little revenues. However, a company is able to sell them solar panels, and with no subsidies. They sell the solar panels that are very expensive. You know it in Europe, in the US, everywhere, they're subsidized. But in this place, they don't need to subsidize them because there's a need. There is no electrification, and people want access to electricity not for lighting, not for cooking, but for communication. They want to be able to charge their cell phones. They want to have access for a few hours a day to internet. And so they will be ready to pay whatever it takes to get that solar panel. So they usually go into some microfinance scheme and get the company working with them to see when is the best time for them and what's the best price they can pay every month. But then it happens. And this would not happen in Spain or in Europe. That's, I think, something very interesting, is that we are provided by history and by the inventivity of a lot of people with tons of solutions that we can get inspiration from and then adapt it locally. But I don't think there's like a big one-shot solution. People have been promoting CCS, carbon capture and sequestration, as an intermediate term solution to our problems, because you could store the carbon from coal plants, which are majoritary today, into the earth, and thus get rid of the problem that you don't have, get rid of the emissions problem by still using electricity. But this will not be helpful for the developed countries, for example, even though it would be a big step forward for the US, who are very reliant on coal, for instance. I'm not sure that was a good answer either, but that's the best I can get. Well, thank you very much for spending that time this afternoon with me. And we have a website. It's mostly in French, but there's a few pictures, and you don't need translations for those. Thank you.